This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. This podcast is provided with the understanding that it does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. If you're looking for help, seek out a qualified medical services provider or other healthcare professional. Welcome to the Live Your Yoga podcast, a podcast dedicated to discovering and sharing all the ways in which yoga can be lived off the mat. Real stories by real people, just like you.
Welcome to the Live Your Yoga podcast. Over the next few months, we are featuring some of the fantastic podcast episodes featured in our trauma-informed yoga course. The course itself is filled with wisdom, insight, and actionable steps and practices we can take to help heal ourselves and the world around us. These podcast episodes are windows into some of the course content, and we hope you enjoy this series. You can find out more info about the course by clicking the link below.
Welcome to this podcast, everyone. My name is Juan, and today I am with Nancy Frolic, and we are both faculty at Your Yoga Flow. And today, Nancy is actually going to start the conversation. And we are very excited to be able to provide this information to you all. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Juan. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
So today we're going to explore your ancestral roots through the umbrella of the topic of intergenerational trauma that we have been exploring through the trauma-informed yoga course. Mm-hmm. And before I ask you questions or expand on that a little bit, I just wanted to share a quote to start. It was written in 1877 by Crazy Horse. I salute the light within your eyes where the whole universe dwells. For when you are at the center within, you and I am that place within. We shall be one. So what I like about this quote is, first of all, that it was what now seems like a long time ago, 1877. From an understanding that we are all connected, which is very much along the understanding, the new contemporary understanding of intergenerational trauma and epigenetics, is that, well, and it's also related to the yoga understanding of karma, and that we all come into the world with these ancestors, that they were a part of us, either unconsciously or consciously as we become more aware of them. Mm-hmm. So I thought it would be really interesting, Juan, to talk to you today. First of all, just wondering what you know about your ancestral roots. Do you know a lot about your ancestors' histories and stories?
Yes, but could you remind me again who wrote the quote that you just mentioned?
Oh, sure. It's from Crazy Horse, who, I can find out more specifics, but from an indigenous tribe from 1877. Yeah, I can find out more of that.
Okay, cool. I wasn't sure if you said Crazy Horse or something else. I was like, did I have that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I didn't know anything about my ancestors until a few years ago. And I always wondered who my ancestors were. But a few years ago, do you want the long explanation or the short explanation?
I want the long explanation, but before you go into that, you must have known a little bit about your ancestors. You're from
zero.
Like from your parents? You don't even know where they're from?
So I knew I knew that my family obviously I'm from Colombia. I was born in Colombia. So, and once my dad told me that his grandfather was from Spain, but that was it.
That's it.
Out of that, everybody else had always been from here and from ancestors from here, but I never knew exactly where all these ancestors generations ago came. And in school, they teach you that in Colombia, 33% are European, 33% are Indo-American, and 33% are African. That's kind of like what they teach you, but each region is different. Like there is some regions where an African culture is going to be heavier than European culture, and there's regions where the European culture is going to be heavier. So I think that's just like a generalization. So you think, because it is a generalization, you think that you are 33% all these things, or that is, that's the best that you know about your culture.
Right.
So now with the longer explanation, so a few years ago, I think it was 2020 or 2021, that my family looked into a law in Spain and Portugal that allowed people who could prove that the ancestry was from Sephardic Jews that were expelled during the 1400s and the 1500s, were expelled from the peninsula, the Iberic Peninsula, which used to be one country, Portugal and Spain. Now they're separated. But so anyone who could prove that their ancestors were from either of those regions, then they could get citizenship from Spain or Portugal. And I believe that some of my family members, maybe not like close family members, but like, the son of my dad's cousin, or, kind of like family members who are a bit more extended than the usual. We started to hear that they would be getting they were allowed to get citizenship from Portugal or Spain because they had done the process. And so we started to question whether, because they were not close family members, but they were close-ish family, that there would be, that their ancestry was Sephardic Jews. So my brother wanted to look into that, and we decided to look into it and to hire someone who would basically look at our family tree and give us confirmation that we came from Sephardic Jews. So my sister looked into, I think it was ancestry.com or something, like one of those websites where you can look at your family tree, and she found out that she found something that looked like we came from Sephardic Jews. So then we gave that information to the professional who studies the family trees, and in fact he gave us the confirmation that we came from a Sephardic Jew. His name was Luis Zapata, who came from Spain, and his parents had been converted from the Jewish culture into the Catholic culture. They had been converted because the Spanish Inquisition asked everyone to convert or to leave the country.
Can I just ask one question?
Yes.
Would this be on your father's side of the family or your mother's?
Both. So we discovered that the same ancestor is on both. So I think my mom and dad converge. So that was like 13 generations ago. I think my mom and dad had the same ancestor for 7 generations. So then 7 or 8 generations back, we saw that there was a split. But the 13th generation back was the same person. In fact, then my family decided to do the process of applying for citizenship in Portugal because Spain had stopped at the time. Portugal continued with the law. So once you do a process like that, there is a lot of help on the internet. So we joined several groups of other people who were doing the same process. And we discovered that the group that my sister joined, it was a WhatsApp group here in the region where I'm from in Colombia. Mostly everyone came from the same person. So they were all going back to the same ancestor.
Wow.
and it's most of the region. Like this region is heavily Jewish.
So this one person came to Colombia and created all these generations of your family. Wow.
Yeah, basically of the European of the European ancestry. She was the one who kind of like was one of the people that arrived, and then all this mostly everyone who's from Europe, who has an European background, came from him in the region. Is like the province. Is the province where I'm from and where I grew up. So, but we discovered that we don't know if he was Jew or if he was Catholic. We know that his parents in Spain were Catholic, but they were Jews first. So the interesting thing about this information is that Sephardic Jews are slightly different from, I think it's called Ashkenazi, or kind of like
I don't know the term. All I know is it's a different, Sephardic is different, but yeah, I don't know.
Like in a way is the same, obviously, but they were differentiated. All those Jews from the Iberic Peninsula were separated from the rest, and so they were given the name Sephardic, and also they had a different language, which was a combination of Hebrew and Latin and Castellano, which was the Spanish of the time, and kind of like a mixture of Latin languages and Hebrew. And they, because I've now listened to a lot of podcasts around this information, and I read a lot of information about it, and I had to research a lot because I also created a DAS piece about it. But from what I know is that they did not speak Hebrew. So because I believe the Hebrew language is very much connected to the Jewish tradition, but not for the Sephardic Jews. They kind of have their own traditions. So because they didn't speak Hebrew, and then they came to Latin America, whether they had converted or not, they came to Latin America, and then there was no way for anyone to find them because they wouldn't speak Hebrew, or they wouldn't do their Jewish rituals with the Hebrew language. So from what I know, the Hebrew or the Jewish rituals were very much kept indoors, and to the outside you were Catholic, but indoors you could do whatever you wanted. So we don't know if Luis Zapata, who came here, whether she grew up Jewish or Catholic, even though his parents were known to be Catholic. We don't know to what extent they actually were converted to Catholicism, because people indoors would do whatever, they wanted to do. And actually, I think the latter is the true, because a lot of our Catholic costumes here in Antioquia actually come from Jewish traditions. So in fact, they did say that they were Catholic, but inside doors they were still practicing. So for instance, in Christmas on December 7th, we have Candle Day, where we light up candles. And I grew up, my mom told me that it was for the Virgin Mary, but is something very similar to Hanukkah, because I believe Hanukkah starts December 7th. So, and also, there is a big emphasis on the Virgin Mary here in the Catholic tradition of Antioquia, which is a province of Colombia. I would say that the Virgin Mary has a stronger presence than Jesus, which is also a big thing in the Jewish culture. The kind of like the Virgin Mary. So,
and in Mexico as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
sure.
They all came not only to Colombia, but everywhere. So, so I discovered that it must have been very traumatized for them to had to leave their home to convert or to stay, but had to convert or to show that you now were Catholic, or basically just to know that you were rejected, that you were not welcome based on your costumes. I think that must have been very traumatizing, and had to hide yourself and who you are. And also I read that the ones who came here that were still Jewish, they were still being persecuted. So it didn't end in Spain. People who were in Colombia, who believed in the kingdom of Spain, that were living here, they would also persecute them. So it was a never-ending suffering.
And can you talk about your research and the creation of your dance piece around this research? Yeah. So I knew nothing about the Jewish culture because I grew up Catholic. And in Vancouver, where I lived for many years, Vancouver, Canada, there was a dance friend of mine who she was a little bit more ahead of me when it came to the dance career, I guess. Like, she went to school first, and when I was in dance school, she was already choreographing for us and things like that. So she was a bit ahead, but we were friends because we danced for a company when I was studying and when she was kind of like graduated from school. And so throughout the years, I saw that she kind of like became, I don't know, she became a very interesting artist to me. Everything she did was very interesting, and I wanted to work with her more. But she was kind of cool, and I didn't see myself as cool, so I never kind of like approached her or anything. But then eventually I approached her and I said that I wanted to work with her. This was after a few years, and she said yes. So we started working. This was 2017. So we started working together on something that we didn't know what it was, but she basically just gave me a free week for me to use her as a choreographer on creating a solo for me, and just to see where it would go. And interestingly enough, it came around the piece that we created that week, that solo piece that we created that week for me. It was about family, and it had to do with family names and kind of like drawing family names in space with the body and different tasks like that. But then that didn't go anywhere, really. I think I applied for a couple of grants, didn't get them, and then I left it. And then in 2020, 2021, when my family discovered our ancestry, I was like, oh, maybe I want to do a dance piece about this. And I already studied this dance piece with Vanessa, and it's about family. Maybe I can approach her and tell her the new research that I know of, and maybe we can expand it more. So when I contacted her, she's like, oh yeah, I'm Jewish. She wasn't practicing the Jewish culture, but she grew up Jewish. She grew up going to Jewish camps, and she kind of knew the rituals, and she speaks Hebrew, and her family is from Israel. So it kind of like, it all made sense. And I was like, oh, okay, great. So basically it was like, yeah, I'm Jewish and I can guide you through whatever it is that you want to do.
So we continue with the piece. So then I got grant money for it, and then we developed it, and then a couple of dance festivals in the city picked it up and presented it, and it was a piece about, even though Vanessa is not Sephardic Jew, it was mostly a piece about expulsion. It wasn't really about... It was a piece about expulsion, and we had some rituals, Jewish rituals, that we use in the piece, but that we made a bit abstract. So the piece would connect not only to people who came from the Jewish culture, but to anyone who ever felt that they have been expelled. Or, I mean, there is so much expulsion right now in the world. In all cultures, not just one. So we kind of made some Jewish rituals abstract and things like that. And I used Spanish as text in the piece. I spoke Spanish. I told the story in Spanish, different areas in the piece. And yeah, it was very interesting because I would, for instance, explain how a dish is made. And this dish is a Jewish dish that I grew up thinking it was Colombian. So things like that, and talking about people being expelled from Spain and arriving in Colombia, but we don't really know a lot about their history because they were supposed to be hidden. So there are no records. We know that Jewish people came here, and people who had already converted to Catholicism from the Jewish culture came in, but we don't know. And we know that we have some rituals and costumes from them that were hidden and then became Catholic, or part of our food, or part of our clothing, or the traditional clothing, or the music. But we don't know how that happened. So it's like the missing link kind of thing. There is only speculations. For instance, so I'm from Medellin, and the province is called Antioquia, which is a very Hebrew name, and the capital of Antioquia before Medellin was another town called Santa Fe de Antioquia, and Santa Fe is a very beautiful town here. Is a very colonial town, or colonial architecture, but it is very hard to get to. I mean, there is roads, but it is like in the mountains. Is at the time of where Spanish came here, it was impossible to get there. Like, you would basically make your way into the mountains, put your town there, and then never leave, and just have everything there. And they made it difficult to find. So then the bishop or the pope or people sent by the pope from Europe wouldn't find you, basically, and see your culture.
You're safe.
And exactly. And they had a really rich culture there. You know, they had lots of food, and they built a town, but to the outsiders, they would send letters to the outsiders saying, don't come here. This is garbage. Like, this is a very horrible area. It's hard to get to. Don't come here because, yeah, it's just difficult. But it wasn't that way. It's just so then they would be left alone, and people wouldn't bother them. They were also looking for gold, mining gold. So I also researched that they had to move because they were basically nomads. They had to move to look for gold, and Taos moved with them. Like, the names of Taos would move with them. But then eventually, where the town is now, I don't think is, they were always in that area. Like, I don't think they had to move too long. They moved maybe 3 or 4 times, but that could always happen in the same area. So yes, it was basically in the Andes Mountains, and it was hard to get to. And a lot of towns in Colombia are like that, are in the Andes Mountains, are now easy to get to because there's roads that connect them. But like, you and I we went to the coffee tour because Nancy came to Colombia. We went to this town that was basically on a hill, and it was like a dirt road to get there, and you don't know where. And there's like there's like, a church and a convent and just a few houses. But that's basically how towns used to be here. They were like very remote, so then people wouldn't find them, so they could continue with their cultures and things like that. So, yeah.
So that's so fascinating. Lots of questions came up, but the first thing that I want to ask you about is because I've known you when you lived in Vancouver, and I know a little bit about, you made a choice to leave Colombia and start a life in Vancouver, and then you made a choice to go back home. But do you see sort of any connection to your Sephardic Jewish past in that? I mean, you weren't so much expelled, but you did leave Colombia for reason, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that I also wrote that in my grant application, that my ancestors left to find a better life, and I also left to find a better life. So I'm gay, and when I left Colombia, that was 2003, so 21 years ago. It was very different from the Colombia that I know today, or at least my city used to be very conservative. So I left for, basically that reason. And at the time, a lot of people were also leaving, and there was a civil war going on. And people were it was kind of like, if you could leave, do it, for any reason, not only because you're queer. So yeah, and in Canada, I just felt that I could totally be myself and also be far away from my family, so they wouldn't come off it. It's kind of like similar. You make it hard. You make it hard. You make it hard for people to find you. So yeah, because you don't want to invite them to your life because it was rejected once. So those are the similarities. I think that we are always leaving to find better versions of ourselves. And in Vancouver, like at the time, I'm sure that we found a lot of homophobic people too. So it's not like you always think that the grass is greener on the other side, and it could be, like a lot of the time it is. But you always also find a lot of the same obstacles, and you kind of still have to go through it in different ways, instead of thinking that you are completely free of that problem. It's almost like the problem follows you, and you have to find ways to deal with it anyways.
We can't erase our familiar roots as much as we might want to, right?
Yes.
But
all
right, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, when you said there was a civil war going on, like you grew up during a pretty intense time in Colombia.
Yeah.
Like you've told me a few stories. Like if we're talking about trauma and what you were experiencing as a young boy, that was traumatic, don't you think?
Yeah. And so my province, I mean, this is what people say in Colombia. Like if you talk to someone who's not from my province, they see my province is almost like the Catalonia of Spain or the Quebec of Canada. It's like we want to separate, and we want to have our own country, and we want to have our own rules because I don't know about Catalonia in Spain or Quebec in Canada, but we see our industry and culture as really strong and very different from the country. Even the way we speak is very different. So people from outside that understand Jewish culture say, well, that is because you came from Jewish people that were the people who were known to be like nomads, who would look for gold in other countries, who would move around, who would colonize, who kind of like would just be very pushy, like very PETA people, pushy and wanting to take over the world kind of thing.
Right.
So and it is even said, I don't know how true this theory is. It is even said that the trip of Cristobal Columbus to Americas wasn't sponsored by the Kingdom of Spain, but it was sponsored by Jewish people who needed to leave.
Oh, interesting.
So because they had the money, they were the rich people at the time, or that's what they say. So it's interesting because once you understand kind of like where your ancestors come from and everything they had to deal with and everything they suffered, they also put a lot of people. They also they colonized. They killed people. They brought Africans to be their slaves. So, for their minds and all that stuff. So it's interesting. And this is something that I have issues with this piece that I created, is that in a way it's like I'm showing the hardship, or I'm talking about the hard part of my ancestors coming or leaving their home, and I also had to go through that. But I don't touch on the consequences of that. So something that I struggle with, because now we have the Palestinian-Israeli war in the world, and making a dance piece about Jewish being persecuted and suffering, I don't think is right, because we also have the Palestinian people suffering and being persecuted, and we actually maybe know way less about them than we know about the Jewish people. So their stories are not as told as the stories of Jewish people are. So it's a huge conflict.
And the stories we've been told are so questionable, right? Like, who's been telling us what stories?
Exactly.
But I think this is just a new piece for you. Like, the piece that you created was the beginning of something.
Right.
And it was very well received at a kind of interesting time in history. And now maybe there's another piece that you need to create.
Maybe. That's true. I mean, because I presented this piece twice last year. Once was in July, was before the war. And that felt very different. I had people from Israel come to the piece, and they were really touched by it, and they were really nice and welcoming and kind of like family to me. And then in November, when the piece was going to be shown again at another festival that was during the war, then the whole environment changed. And even people didn't want to go to the festival, and there was lots of security outside of the festival. So it's interesting how that changed in a year, the way that we view history changed in a year. So and I felt uncomfortable showing that piece again in November when that whole thing was going on. So maybe you're right. Maybe it just needs to be revisited, and
like all of I think we're learning this, right? Like all of history, we have been told such a, like you said earlier, like when the colonizer comes and colonizes, it's not a peaceful experience, right? Like there's a whole traumatic history of that. But can you talk? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say one last thing. And when I moved to Canada, I had no idea about the Indigenous people in Canada. And I come from a place where there's a lot of Indigenous people, but it's just, I mean, Canada is ahead of Colombia in terms of acknowledging what happened to the Indigenous people. But
beginning to countries,
compared to other countries, like compared to Colombia, I think Canada is ahead.
Recently, I mean, I grew up. I'm 60. How old am I? 62. And I grew up when the residential schools were going on, and like it was never spoken. I didn't know about it.
Right.
It was very hidden. Yeah.
But for instance, like in terms of like land acknowledgement, we don't do that in Colombia. And in Canada, we've been doing land acknowledgement for a while. Not that that's going to fix everything, but the awareness around it is, I think, the awareness of it is a bit more in Canada than, and I think Australia as well, than it is here. Anyways, so that's to say that when you arrive to a new place, there's so much to discover, and then you also realize that, oh yeah, I'm just arriving in Canada, a better life for me, but I'm adding to this population of people who've been here for decades, sort of oppressing the Indigenous people. So it's like, oh yeah, I guess I'm another, in a way, like I'm another colonizer. So is this story repeating itself again? Yeah.
Can you go back and just talk a little bit about your childhood and what was going on in your country at that time? Not for any kind of dramatic storytelling, but more around the idea of how trauma becomes normalized. Right? Like you grew up in a very kind of horrific time.
Trauma gets though. Well, I don't know if trauma gets normalized, but like events that cause trauma are normalized.
That's a better way. That's a better way of putting it. Yes.
So like, I grew up like with bombs, like hearing bombs exploding, killing people, and my whole house will shake and hundreds and thousands of people will be dead, and that's all you know. You listen to that growing up, and you think that's okay, that's okay, that's normal. It is scary, but it's normalized. And same with traveling by car from one city to another. The gorillas were usually in the jungle. So if you wanted to go from one city to the other, like if we wanted, so Medellin is kind of like northwest, but we still have the ocean. Maybe that is a 10-hour drive. The ocean is still a 10-hour drive. So if we wanted to go to the ocean or to the Caribbean, which is north, because Colombia also has a Caribbean coast. If we wanted to go to the Caribbean coast, we had to go through roads in the jungle and go through other cities and things like that. So then that maybe the last trip we did with my family was when I was 6 years old, because after that they were starting to kidnap people. And so then nobody would ever travel through road anymore. And that was normalized. You wouldn't travel by car because you would be kidnapped. And so you start to learn what not to do in order to avoid suffering. But I mean, the news are full of it. And my city was the second most dangerous city in the world in the 90s. So you kind of grew up in this bubble where things are happening around you, but you don't know, or you know, but you know they are there, but you don't feel them because you're well protected in your bubble. And you do hear things happening, like bombs exploding, but you don't see them. You maybe see it through the news. So all that becomes normalized. And then once you go outside of the country, if you can travel and go somewhere else, and you realize that there is peace in other places. So it's like, well, how is this possible? Why not where I am from?
Yeah. So sort of coming toward the end of our chat, how do you see who Juan is today with all this new information you have about not only your personal history, but also about trauma and collective trauma? And do you feel like Like this journey has informed and shaped you in a different way?
I think so. I mean, part of me wants to move to Europe, basically like to go back where I came from. So then I don't have to like bother people here.
Like to go back to Portugal or Spain?
Yeah, part of me is like, well, I'll just go back to Europe because this is not my land. But I also love Spain, so I wouldn't mind living in Spain. But yeah, I don't know. I guess it raises more questions for sure, more than answers. But also, in a way, I love to travel and I love to be nomadic. So in a way, I'm like, oh, well, I guess that makes sense because I guess it's in my DNA, that I'm kind of like, I love to go to other places. Once I find a reason to be in one place, I don't tend to leave. Like right now, my dog is 14 and he's very old, so I prefer to stay with my dog and be here for years if I have to. But after my dog is no longer with us, I'm like, I don't know if I'm gonna want to just hang out here. So I think I do have that in me, that need to go to other places and know other places and travel. And I have more questions for sure than I used to before. So it's almost like, so you have more questions, but on the other hand, you do understand yourself better of like the things you like to do and why you were more attracted to a place than another place. And I do believe that, in kind of like that memory that gets carried through ancestry. So I am really like, I love going to Portugal and I love going to Spain. I feel at home there. So now I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And yeah, and in Canada, even though I love Vancouver and Canada, I felt like I had to be there only just to be safer and to maybe earn a better currency than Colombian pesos instead of a kind of working Canadian dollars and save money. And, like all those things that you kind of like tell yourself of going to somewhere else and working there and being a citizen of that place. But I never felt that I belonged there. I do see it as one of my homes because I spent 20 years in Canada. So I do miss like the West Coast and the trees and the mountains and BC and hiking and kind of like everything that happens in BC, but that only kind of happens there. Like once you leave, because you have, I can go hiking here too and things like that, but like the culture is of outdoor. The outdoor culture is very much embedded in the West, in the Western Canada culture. So because I was introduced to that, then I missed that. But it's not like, oh, I'm just gonna go to Canada to do that. It was because I was there, so I did it. So yeah, now I'm like, okay, yeah. I definitely, because I'm back in Medellin now, living again in Medellin. And I feel that being here feels just natural, is now caught up with the times a bit more, so is more open-minded, and there's a lot of more foreigners coming into the city, and it just feels a bit more metropolitan than 20 years ago. So I feel even more at home here. But I guess that's, and I thought that I would never come back, and I thought that that it wasn't my role, more that I didn't belong. But I think everything that's happened, traveling, being a bit nomadic, knowing about my ancestry, about who my ancestors were, all that has helped in feeling more at home coming back to Colombia and being more comfortable leaving Canada and not thinking that I have to stay in Canada forever. because that was the mentality at the beginning when I moved there. So, but definitely more questions that I don't know if they will be answered, but I don't know if they have to be answered, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, having visited you and managing and knowing you here, I'm in Vancouver. It really warmed my heart to see you. Like it felt like you were home. To speak your language, to drive like I never experienced you driving in Vancouver. Like for me, it was this is who Juan is. This is where he's from, which was very different than knowing you in Vancouver. So I'm happy that you're there, and I hope you get to Spain on your next nomadic journey.
Thank you.
And I hope you think about creating another piece, because I think it's necessary, right? It's an interesting time in history, and I think, well, certainly for myself, learning like, the stories we've been told aren't necessarily all, we haven't got the whole picture, right? Like that. Our history has been very informed by by patriarchy, basically. But,
And then, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's,
thanks, Nancy. I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Juan. It was great to hear your story.
Thank you. And everyone else, thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, you know that you can always find us. So thank you, Nancy. And thank you everyone else for listening.
Okay. Bye.
And bye.